shadows of Christ that were kind of pointing to Christ, and how this story kind of parallels the Christian story. And it's not kind of arbitrarily said that way. Hebrews describes it as a shadow in Hebrews chapter 10. And 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it actually talks about our very passage this week, Exodus 13 through 18. It talks about this very section as something written for our example, for our instruction. Both words are used to describe how we're supposed to be reading this. And it really is a beautiful thing. I want to start actually just by sharing just a quick passage from John chapter 10. One of the many sayings of Jesus about why he came to live and what he came to accomplish. In John chapter 10, it's kind of a simple phrase. He says, "The thief comes only to steal, to kill, and destroy. I come, why? That they may have life, and life more abundantly." Life that is, and the word means surpassing, that it's more than just what's around you. It's spreading out to life abundantly. That's what he came to do, to give us life abundantly. But many of you know this. Many of you know what the Israelites were experiencing the moment they went into the wilderness. Not everything about following God means that we're going to have an easy life, that it's going to be kind of easy and kind of, I don't know the word for it perfectly to describe it, at ease of what we're accomplishing. No, God has bigger plans for us than just to give us an easy life. I want to share with you kind of 3 texts just to show what was going on in the minds of the Israelites. They've just left Egypt, and in our section, this is the story of them going through the dry land of the Red Sea. God parts the waters, they pass through it, it crashes down on the Egyptians, and the Israelites are already complaining about this. Let me just share one story before. This is from Exodus chapter 14. Listen to what the Israelites, who just witnessed the 10 plagues, who just saw that God could cause the sun to shine on their part of the town and not on the part of the Egyptians, who could kill all the firstborn of the Egyptians but protect theirs, who could do all these miracles, and yet this is what they say when they first enter into the wilderness. Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 11. This is what they complain. "Then they said to Moses, 'Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness.'" Fast forward a little bit. Now they've parted the sea after this happens. Chapter 16, starting in verse 2. Lo and behold, the Israelites just witnessed what is one of the greatest miracles that has ever happened. And one of the first things the Israelites do once again is complain that things were better in Egypt. Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse 2. Listen to what the text says. "The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the sons of Israel said to them, would it be that we have died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full? For you've brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Sounds a bit dramatic, but you can see the heart behind all of this. One final text about this, and really I think probably the most telling one of all of this, is in actually the book of Numbers. They don't just get over this quickly. It goes on for a couple generations. But in Numbers chapter 11, listen to how they complain, and specifically listen to what they say was better in Egypt. So Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 and following. This is what they say. "The rabble, the grumblers, those complainers who were among them, had greedy desires. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlics. But now our appetite is gone. There's nothing at all to look at except this manna." You can see that this is the heart of the Israelites going through this. The things they're complaining about are really just matters of comfort and ease. They're saying, okay, well, you provided food because we complained about that, but that's not the right kind of food. We don't like these wafers that taste a little bit like honey, the way that the scriptures describe them. We don't like that it's provided that way. We don't even like that we have to gather 2 days worth on the Sabbath, and so we're going to gather extra on one day. I mean, the whole time they're complaining, they're missing eating leeks and onions. I don't know what their appetite would have been like in Egypt, but if you're missing leeks and onions, you're kind of desperate for something back there. But the bigger point I'm wanting you to see with this, the connection that I'm wanting us to see, isn't just that they were complaining things were better. It's that they were complaining over many times small things. I miss eating onions, so I want to go back to being a slave again. When you put it that way, that slavery is worth it as long as I get to eat my leeks. Slavery is worth it as long as I get to sit around a pot full of meat. No, no, no. Don't you remember that you were in slavery? Don't you remember that Pharaoh killed all of your young men because he was afraid they would rise up? Don't you remember he threw them into the Nile? Don't you remember what God did to save you from that? And here you are complaining about onions. What's going on with that? Well, what's going on with that is still true today. It's very, very common to see that majority of people who want to go back to their old way of life, the majority of people who leave the faith, I want you to hear this, don't do it over big reasons. They do it slowly, missing comforts, and you don't hear from them very often, and they slowly creep back into it, and eventually they start thinking, hey, things were better before I had God. Things were better when I was engrossed in that. Things looked better when I'm in that. What I'm wanting you to see from this story, what I'm hoping I see from this story, is there's always this creeping temptation for us as Christians to, go back into Egypt, to creep back into being a slave, to not following God with all that He has for us. But I want to hear, and I really want to kind of nail down a simple point about all of this today. It's really simple, and I hope you catch what I'm trying to say. Don't go back to Egypt. If this story, as Paul says, was written for our example, for our instruction, and if Egypt is kind of representing this life of sin, this life of slavery, and for some reason the Israelites wanted to go back there for comfort, if that's all true, then the Christian that I want to try to cultivate, myself and all of us here, what I'm wanting us to see is that we should not go back. Plain and simple. Life is not better without God, even if it's in the wilderness. Life without Him is better whenever I'm on His plan. And I want to just kind of dive into that and just give you two kind of big things taken from the story about why we shouldn't go back. So I want to spend the rest of my time just kind of two small points here. But really, the points that I'm going to talk about are the same reasons about why I'm still a Christian, why you ought to still be a Christian, why you shouldn't slowly fade away. And I hope if you're slowly fading away, my honest prayer for you today is that you catch yourself before you go back, before it's too late, before I don't hear from you for years and years, or whatever it is that takes to fall away. I want to read that text again from Philippians chapter 3, because it really marks out the whole of what we're going to talk about today. This is the story of Paul's life. I mean, if you're someone who's faithful at this point in his life, it's probably the Apostle Paul. Okay, he's been imprisoned, he's been stoned a couple different times, thought dead, left outside of his city, whipped, all of the persecutions. And in Philippians chapter 3, Paul says, just kind of plain and simple, I'm not there yet. I'm not in the promised land. I'm not where I'm finally arriving. But this is why I press on. This is why it's worth it to keep fighting for what God has for me. So in Philippians chapter 3, look at verse 12, and I'm going to read 12 through 14. He says, not that I have already obtained it or have already become perfect, but I press on. I'm not there yet, but I'm still going, so that I may lay hold of that for which I was also laid hold of by Christ. Brethren, I do not regard myself as laying hold of it yet, but this thing I do know, forgetting what lies behind, forgetting Egypt, reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press on towards that goal of the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. What's he saying there? Well, in other terms, in other places, he describes it this exact way, that the Christians should be pressing on, not because we haven't experienced all that God has in store for us. So there's a reason to keep going. I want you to hear this, and I'm going to come back to this point later. The Israelites started complaining in the wilderness, but they didn't realize that that wasn't their final destination yet. And in fact, in Philippians chapter 3, the word that Paul uses to describe where he is going, it's the Latin word there is just the word where we get our English destination from, that he's pressing on towards where the destination is, but he's not there yet. There's still work to be done along the way. So I want to just go through kind of 2 points about why we should not go back. If I was with the Israelites and if I saw a bunch of people who were kind of grumbling, not that we would ever grumble, if I'm hearing somebody rambling about why we should go back and things were really good in Egypt back when we were slaves, this is what I would say to them. This is why we shouldn't go back to Egypt. Because we should remember, first of all, what he has done for us. We should remember what he has done for us. Now, I don't know what it is in my mind, but I can remember numbers, I can remember sentences, I can remember faces, but for whatever reason, these little things in my life, I am a constant forgetter about. I say goodbye to people every Sunday morning, and inevitably, I come back in because I forgot my keys, and I go back out, and I come back in because I forgot my wallet, and I go back out, and I come back in because I forgot something else, and I'll keep saying goodbye for real this time, even though it's not really goodbye for real, because I'm going to see you in a moment. My memory is so bad. I once met up with someone somewhat recently for breakfast, and I didn't actually even tell my wife I did this yet, I don't think. But I left my keys in the ignition because I was listening to a sermon, and I realized, oh my goodness, I need to go in. I forgot I was meeting with somebody. I left the car running, and I went into the restaurant and sat down with my car running and no one inside of it. And that might seem like kind of a strange thing that doesn't happen very often. That kind of stuff happens in my life all the time. It genuinely does. I forget things very often. But I say this because, if we do forget things all the time, if I want to hold on to, I really do, those things that if I remember these, then I will be found faithful. The Israelites had a problem of forgetting. I certainly have a problem of forgetting, but I have never known a Christian who was practicing something in an unfaithful way, who was at that moment remembering what Christ had did for us. You'll notice this when you're tempted by something. And it can be a number of things, whether it's pornography, whether it's drinking or gossiping, all sorts of things. The thing that Satan does not want you to do, the thing the enemy does not want you to do in that moment is to remember who Christ is for you. As long as he can get you to not think about him, he doesn't have to make you hate him. He doesn't have to make you say bad things about him. But as long as you're not thinking about him, he can get you to do just about anything. If you can go about your life never remembering God, you've already lost. And that's what happened for the Israelites. The problem with the Israelites wasn't that they were saying evil things about God. The problem was that they forgot God existed, that he was there, that he was present. So Christians are at their best, most importantly, Christians are at their best when they remember what God has done for them. It's amazing, isn't it, if you read this story, how quickly they can forget all that God did for them. It's amazing, they were there, they saw the frogs coming out of the Nile, they saw the gnats, they saw the diseased cows of all the Egyptians, but not their own cows. They saw that the sun was shining brightly at their house, but a couple of houses down where the Egyptians lived, they looked over and it was utter darkness until Moses prayed and God took it away. They saw and heard the Egyptians mourning that their firstborn had been killed, and the text explicitly says not a single house was left without someone dead. But the Israelites, no one was touched. They saw all of that happen. They stood at the Red Sea and saw fire come down, preventing the Egyptian army from coming to them. They saw the waters part, and they walked under the water on dry land with walls of water on both sides. They saw God do all of that. and then they still forgot what God did for them. It's quite like, I really do want you to see it this way. It's quite like when we forget what Christ did for us. When we don't think that we should have the right to approach him, when we think that he doesn't want us to approach him, doesn't want us to know him because we're not that special, we're forgetting what he went through for us, that he took on flesh from holding the world to being held by a woman of his own creation, this poor young Jewish woman. He went from all of that to the point of suffering, being betrayed and left by all of his friends, having nails driven through his wrists and hands to a cross, dying on the cross. That's what he has done for us. And if I can remember that, I can be faithful during anything. If you can remember Christ, as Paul says, setting your eyes on Christ Jesus, on what is unseen, you'll be found faithful in any situation. If you could remember who God is. I want to go back actually to the passage I read during communion. This is from Nehemiah chapter 9. And in Nehemiah chapter 9, kind of recounts a lot of this story. But I want you to pay attention once again to what it says about the importance of remembering. Nehemiah chapter 9, and we'll start in verse 16 and verse 17. And I just want you to see and answer this basic question. Why did the Israelites fail? Why did they want to go back to Egypt? It's a really simple answer. Verses 16 through 17 in Nehemiah. But they, our fathers, acted arrogantly. They became stubborn and would not listen to your commandments. They refused to listen and did not remember your wondrous deeds which you had performed among them. So they became stubborn and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. I mean, things had to be kind of miserable from their perspective to want to appoint a leader and go back and be a slave to a bunch of defeated Egyptians. And life wasn't just bad there, it was proven to be useless and utterly pointless in Egypt to be serving all those gods. That's what we talked about last week. But here they are wanting to go back to it. Later on in the Psalms, they actually talk about this very thing. I want to read to you one of the Psalms. There's several that talk about this. Go home and read Psalm 95 tonight, and you'll kind of see all of this story once again. But in Psalm 78, I want to read verses 11 through 13. And once again, focus on what it says they did in this psalm. So Psalm 78, verse 11. They forgot his deeds and his miracles that he had shown them. He wrought wonders before their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made it the waters to stand up like a heap. You're still forgetting that. I mean, you want to just reach into the story and say, wait a moment, if I was there, I would never be found unfaithful after I saw that. If I could just see one miracle, then I would, believe. And I sympathize with that a little bit because I want to go back and I want to see all of those events happen too. But Christ has already done his work for me on the cross. And I just want to point this out, I don't want to get too far into this, but miracles in the Bible are never very good at convincing people for a long time. Plain and simple. If you want, today I can show you, I have these books in my office of medically documented from scientific journals of miracles that have happened over the last hundreds of years. I've got volumes on this. It's something I've researched myself. But you'll find that most people, when they look into that and are finally convinced, yeah, that was medically documented before and during and after the miracle, but I'm still going to come up with some other excuse. Miracles aren't very good at convincing people for a long time. What is, I have seen, more convincing for people is hearts changed. That is it's much more impactful in our lives. And so what do we see from this? Well, just to reiterate this, the people who will leave the faith most often, most commonly, are not those who get up and say, I denounce Jesus or anything like that. It's the people who forget him in their lives, who don't spend the time to think about it. So let me ask something, and I hope if you're not doing this, this sticks with you in some way. When are you planning this week to remember who Christ is? Do you have any times set aside when you're going to say, that's when I'm going to remember who he is? That's when I'm going to remember what he has done for me. I told you about my memory, and a lot of times that's how it starts, is people want to remember God, and they say, well, if I don't set reminders, I'm going to forget. The origin of the longest standing prayer tradition of what's known as the divine office started long time ago, as early as the first century, because Christians were already forgetting to pray. And so at different points throughout the day, they said, I'm going to pray for this, I'm going to pray for this. And all that I do in my life is just what Christians have done before me, where I have certain times throughout the day, because if I don't have those times, I'm not going to remember. I know myself better than that. Well, let me just paint this picture for you, a not so hypothetical. What if you really intend to start paying attention and remembering God, and you get excited about it, and you go home, and then after a few days you realize that you haven't been doing it? That is the most common experience, and I so feel for you. That's why you've got to be more involved and set up a plan and do all that it takes to remember who God is. Well, I could keep going on that, but I want to get to this second one, because this is the happy part. It's not just remember what he has done for us. Remember where we're going. So if we're going to not go back to Egypt, this is the second reason why. We are going to the promised land. Because we're going to the promised land. Plain and simple, the wilderness is not the destination, but it is where Christians spend most of their lives. We spend most of our lives as Christians, after we've been baptized and after we've kind of entered into this wilderness, we spend most of our time learning about who God is, learning the do's and don'ts, and how to pursue holiness, how to be healed from all the wounds that have been caused to us. But we're looking forward. Christians are not just those who say, well, we have everything that we could possibly want in the here and now. Absolutely not. I mean, there is abundant life. There is a new life. There is a new creation that I am experiencing right now. But I'm looking forward far more than I am just looking to the present. In fact, all that I'm experiencing now really is just a foretaste of what is to come, of this heaven that awaits me. I don't know if you've ever done this to kind of creep on people before, but you can Google Street View, and you can go down streets and look at all the things. When we were moving here, I remember a long time ago, we hadn't heard of Marshfield that much before, and so we set down the Google View on I-44, and I knew as I was making my way down the road, the first thing I saw was the Taco Bell on the right side, and I said, oh yeah, we're fine. We could move there. We're gonna be fine. We have a Walmart. We have all this stuff, but you can kind of go down. But just in a real sense, why am I even talking about this? If I was to look forward to the promised land, if I was to look forward to heaven and walk down these streets, what are the things that I'm going to see? Because it's in thinking about those which, if we really are going there, can I just say, we're not talking about it enough. Why is it the only times we're talking about heaven is when someone's about to die? No, if this really is where we're moving to, if this is where this story ends, can I just suggest that part of the reason you feel so miserable in your life is because you've forgotten where you're going? All of us are on our path either to heaven or to hell. There is no in-between option. And for my life as a servant of God, I want to live my life pursuing this ultimate goal of reaching Him face to face and living in this. And so if I'm going down this street, if I'm looking forward to what's ahead, what is it that I should be fixed on? This is ultimately, not because of Google, but this is what Paul talks about in Hebrews chapter 12. He says this phrase a couple different times throughout his writings. I just want to share with you in the here and the now what it is we should be fixing our gaze on. So Hebrews chapter 12, I'm going to read this text for us. This is verses 1 through 3. He says, therefore, since we have a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and our sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Let me ask it this way: are you looking ahead, or are you miserably caught up in the moment, not able to experience the joy of heaven? I once heard faith described this way, and it was in the context of suffering, so it's not trying to define all that faith is, but just hint at something with it. It's that faith is the ability to dance to the joy of the music of the future. There's something coming that I'm able to, in the present, stand up and say, yeah, now whatever it is in my life, okay, I'm in the wilderness. Okay, I'm stuck eating this. Okay, it's not all that I want yet. That's because this isn't my destination. This is my path towards that final goal. Or as Paul says, just kind of plainly in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 19, and this is really just a short text in a long, long chapter about the resurrection. But he says, if all we have is this life, then we above all else should be pitied. That if the Christian is just saying, well, everything that God offers you is experienced right now, then, well, we're not offering all that God intends, and we ought to be pitied more than everyone, because the wilderness is not a great place to live very often. Yeah, great things happen there. You see God's work oftentimes, water coming out of a rock, manna falling from heaven, people being found faithful, God making himself known. But this is not the destination. This is where we are on our way to what God is preparing for us right now. And so I want you to know, maybe you feel sometimes like it's better for you to go back to Egypt. It's more easy if I were just to not commit the time it takes to be a Christian. I understand that, but this is not the destination. And life in Egypt wasn't that great. Life in slavery, life in sin is not all that it's macked up to be. No, if this is all that we have, then I'm supposed to be pitied. This is not supposed to be all the time comforting. But when I do finally kind of put on my, vision of what heaven will be like, there's a long, long list of people that I'm excited to see. I'm excited to praise God and to be with him, and I do have questions, and maybe when I get there, I'm probably not going to be asking the same things, and I don't know what it will be like when I'm finally there. But I do know that it's going to be good. But I know people I'm going to see there. And I'm excited to see my great-grandparents. I'm excited to actually finally have a conversation with my grandpa, Nichols, who died when I was 4. I'm excited to see my grandma. There's a long list of people, Barry, Joy, people who are suffering, people who in my life have died. Brandon Stuckey, my friend who died when I was a freshman in college in a car wreck. These are all people I expected to be able to talk to for a little bit longer, but I couldn't. When I look to heaven, when I see what's awaiting me, when I realize that's the end of everybody, if I'm already looking at heaven, the present sufferings don't seem so great after all. Even though they're not pleasant, even though they're not comforting. See, having this view of heaven means ultimately that I'm not settling for what I am living and experiencing here right now, because I was never supposed to settle for anything less than heaven. In my family, we have this, and I invite you to come join us. I really do. There's gates named at heaven in Revelation, and there's these 12 gates and for the different tribes of Israel, and one of the gates is the gate of Judah. And ever since I was a small kid, I've always known, my parents have taught me this, and I'm teaching my kids this, and they'll teach it for generations. My whole family is going to meet at Judah Gate together when we first get there. In fact, in my office right now, my brother who's in prison, he gave us all compasses, because believe it or not, they got money from the government with stimulus checks, and what he did was bought us compasses with these. And on the compass, it just says Judah Gate, and it's just pointing in the direction of north. And the whole reminder with that, it's my favorite thing I've ever been given, the whole reminder with that, is no matter where we are in our lives, our family knows, because of Christ, where this ends, and even is going to meet up together to experience it. I invite you to come with us to Judah Gate and see that. No, not everyone is going to make it through the wilderness. I want to just tell you two quick stories, two different people. I had an uncle, passed away when he was 45, I believe. They had all sorts of heart problems from drugs and alcohol use for many lives, but actually ended up getting hit by a car. We always thought he would die from something else. His name was Jeff. He was my mom's brother. And for many years, and we had this kind of strange relationship because he would always relapse, and he was always going back, and he was falling into things he shouldn't do. And finally, one time he switched his life around and really turned the corner. In a sense, he came out of Egypt. And I remember going to Kansas several times, playing ping pong with him, always losing and always getting frustrated that he was better at ping pong, always eating food with him and always laughing, just playing with my cousins. And I remember at his funeral thinking, man, I'm so thankful he got out of that in his life, and I'm so thankful he was faithful to the end, because this could have gone in two totally different directions. That's one of the good stories. That's the person who makes it to the promised land. One of the people I'm excited about whenever I get to heaven. Then you have people like my friend. We'll call him Jordan, because that's his name. And Jordan, how do I say this? He was one of the most joyful people I've ever known. I don't think I'm just saying this to be dramatic. He talked about God more than anyone I've ever met. And he came out of a long history of drugs. He came out of long things. I had the privilege of baptizing him in Turkey Creek in Joplin, and I was a part of a small group with him, and he taught me so much. I supported him on mission trips, really invested my life in him, and he poured into me, and he helped me grow in the faith. And even after college, we stayed in contact, and we were great friends, and he was a preacher somewhere, and then one day I just stopped hearing from him, and I found out he's divorced his wife, he's left all sorts of things, he's left the faith, and I tried reaching out to him, I tried doing this, and the story is not going well for him at this moment. It's not over yet, and I'm praying for him, praying it goes well for him. But not everyone's going to make it into the promised land. I'm wanting you to see that all of these warnings throughout these passages, especially in Hebrews, all of these warnings are just because you came out of Egypt does not mean you're yet in the promised land. Just because you have accepted Christ, it doesn't mean it's over. There's an endurance that's necessary to get to the end, that we need to set our gaze on Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith, so that our heart doesn't grow weary. There's so much more to be done than just hang out in the wilderness. And I've known too many Christians who are satisfied with being in this kind of in-between state and aren't looking forward and aren't remembering God, and ultimately they end up going back to Egypt. What I'm wanting you to see this morning is this great warning that if you decide to go back, if you forget God, you're going to go back and you're not even going to realize it's happening. Or you can be kind of more blatant about it and just stop going altogether. My encouragement today for you, church, is you might have come out, you're in this dark kind of difficult time in the wilderness, but this is not our home. This is not the end. And this is not all that God has in store for you. There are greater joys to still be experienced than just a ticket for whenever I'm going to go to heaven. What I'm wanting you to know ultimately is that God is calling everyone out of slavery. He's calling everyone and giving them this option. And not everyone is going to accept it. I want to end this morning with a passage from Hebrews chapter 3. You'll notice a lot of these warnings come out of Hebrews. There's 6 different warnings just in this one book about not falling away from our faith. But in Hebrews chapter 3, this is what Paul says to the people. Take care, brethren, there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God, but encourage one another today after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end, while it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as when they, the Israelites, provoked me in Exodus. For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but those who were disobedient? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. My prayer today is that this passage is not talking about you, that after hearing about Christ and endurance, that you decide to remember who God is, to not go back to Egypt, and to resolve that, yeah, I'm going to look towards the future, to where God is taking me. Here in a moment, we're going to sing a song like we do every week, and we'll have people around the room. And the whole reason we do this is so that people can have someone to talk to about, what that looks like. And not just at this moment. Most people contact me throughout the week, and that's perfectly fine. We love when that happens. But if you're stuck and you're feeling like you're slipping back into Egypt, you feel like you're slipping back into sin, you realize I'm not remembering God as often as I should, really encourage you to step it up, because not everyone is going to enter, only those who endure. Would you pray with me? Lord, we thank you for what Christ has done, and I pray that he would be where our eyes are fixed, the author and perfecter of our faith. And Lord, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. And I pray for the joy of seeing him and seeing all that he has prepared for us, we would endure whatever this wilderness has for us. Help us, Lord, to be found faithful, to not go back to Egypt. And Lord, if there are those today who need to remember you, who need to remember what has been done for their sake by you, that we would do so. Lord, may we be a community that pursues this together, that journeys in this wilderness together, carrying each other's burdens, fulfilling the law of Christ, and ultimately seeking after that promised land together. It's in Christ's holy name that we pray. Amen.